Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Landheis, and I am the director here at the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And on behalf of Spark, I want to thank you all for taking your time out of your very busy schedules to join us for today's webinar on stalking risk assessment and safety planning. I see that there's about 130 of us on the phone together, which is very exciting. For those of you that are not familiar with Spark, Spark is funded by the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to provide training and technical assistance to criminal justice professionals and others that are working with victims of stalking. Spark provides in-person trainings, webinars, such as the one that you're joining us for today. We record these webinars and they're always available on our website, so feel free to pass the link on to others who weren't able to join you on the phone today. And we also develop materials for Stalking Awareness Month. So January happens to be the 16th anniversary of Stalking Awareness Month. January is in celebration of Stalking Awareness Month every year. So we appreciate all of you who have accessed our website and shared materials to promote the month. And if you haven't done so, we'd highly encourage you to jump on our website, which is stalkingawareness.org. So on that website, we have January materials, we have training modules. So if you're in charge of public education in your community and you need information that you can share with your community on stalking, please check out our training modules. And we have victim resources on there as well. Spark does not provide direct services to victims. We help provide information and training and technical assistance to all of you on the phone who are doing that work. So please don't refer victims directly to us, but there are resources on our website directed towards victims that you can print out and share with victims. They're available in English and currently being translated into Spanish, so check out our Spanish materials as well. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, consider signing up for our newsletter. So you can do all of that on our website, again at stalkingawareness.org, or we encourage you to follow us on social media. So we are on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook with the handle Follow Us Legally. So hopefully you all got my sense of humor with our handle there. And we're going to start today talking about the definition of stalking, which some of you might be like, I already know what the definition is. But what we have discovered is that sometimes we are using the statutory definition of stalking, which each state in the country has a stalking statute, but all of them are different. So instead of using the statutory definition, we often use what we call the behavioral definition of stalking. And we define that as a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And we want to break that down for just a second before we go any further today, because that definition is extremely important. So when we look at the definition and we define a pattern of behavior, many of you will see that in your state statute defined as a course of conduct. And we're going to be spending a lot of time today talking about course of conduct and how that's important in stalking cases. But one of the things to think about is how many different tactics stalkers employ. And when they're employing different tactics, say for instance, we have a stalker who sends a text message to a victim and then the stalker drives by the victim's house. While those are two different behaviors or two different tactics, it's still considered a pattern of behavior because it's done by one person directed at another person. So something important to think about is when we're looking at our criminal justice statutes, when we talk about course of conduct or pattern of behavior, we're usually talking about two or more incidents. Some statutes define that over a certain length of time. Other statutes do not have a certain length of time. And if you need help understanding or interpreting your state statute, feel free to reach out to us at Spark, and we're happy to give you some input to that. The second part of the definition says that stalking is directed at a specific person, but we all know that stalking spills over to other people, usually people that are emotionally impactful to the victim. So for instance, the stalking will spill over to the victim's children, to the victim's family members, to the victim's friends, even their coworkers. So keep in mind that oftentimes we might have a primary victim, but we also have secondary victims. And perhaps we have court-ordered the offender to stay away from the victim, and now the offender is targeting someone else close to the victim because they can no longer target the victim. And then the last part of our definition says that it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And that particular part of the definition can be a little bit problematic when we look at state statutes, because sometimes we have to prove that the offender intended to cause fear in the victim. And sometimes we have victims of stalking who come in and what they are articulating to us isn't fear. They may say things like, I'm frustrated, I'm tired of the behavior that's going on, I feel like nobody's listening to me, but they might not necessarily articulate fear. So we're also going to be spending some time today talking about what does fear look like and what is reasonable fear. So keeping in mind that when we look at these particular stalking cases, one of the most important things to consider is context. That something might be frightening to the victim, but it's not frightening to those of us as responders. I'll give you a very good example. I was in dispatch one time. I've spent 22 years doing this work, and part of that time was working in a law enforcement office. And I was in dispatch, and a victim called and said that somebody had left a cup of coffee in her car. And of course, the reaction was some rolled eyes and not quite understanding why a victim was calling 911 for someone leaving coffee in her car. And what the victim manages to go on and tell us after we asked, why is that important? Why is that something you're calling 911 about? The victim says, he's here. And what she meant was that she had fled across the country trying to escape her abusive ex-husband, and she had gone out to her vehicle, and inside of her locked vehicle was a cup of coffee from Starbucks, made the exact way that she takes it, with the pet name that her ex-husband used to call her written on the coffee cup, and the coffee was still warm. So she knew that he had found her, that he was there, and that he was communicating with her that he was present. But you can imagine if that something like that gets called into law enforcement or explained to others without the context behind it, that can seem like something that's not frightening. People might wonder, why would a victim be scared about someone bringing them coffee? Or why would a victim be scared that somebody sent them a present or somebody sent them roses? So keep in mind that when we look at stalking behaviors, they often have a specific meaning between the victim and the offender that the rest of us don't understand. And so it's really important when we look at risk assessment and safety planning with victims that we have a good understanding of the context of these particular behaviors. The other thing that makes stalking difficult to respond to is that essentially we are criminalizing non-criminal events. It is not criminal to send somebody a text message. It's not criminal to drive down the street, unless, of course, those behaviors are done within the context of a stalking crime. So oftentimes we have victims who are experiencing things who know that it's not criminal to receive a text message, or have been told by responding law enforcement or an advocate or somebody else that they've been working with that there's not much that we can do in these particular cases. So essentially when we look at stalking cases, it's really important to expand beyond just the little tidbit that we might get from victims and really look at the entire big picture of what's going on. And the difficulty with that is that that often takes time and resources that many of us don't have. And so how do we do this work in a way that can help us understand what those stalking behaviors mean, what the level of risk is posed by those stalking behaviors, and how do we respond to victims in a way that encourages them to continue to participate in the system and help us in the gathering of evidence and all those other things. So those are things that we're going to talk about today, but keeping in mind that context with these cases is extremely important. One of the things that gets brought up all the time when Spark is across the country talking about stalking is the prevalence of stalking. Most people are surprised to find that the prevalence rates are actually about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men that will experience stalking. And that's higher than a lot of people expect. And I can tell you that those estimates are actually pretty low. Those estimates come from the NISPIS survey, which used to ask victims of stalking if they were very afraid or extremely afraid of the person that was stalking them, which was problematic because many victims didn't articulate that they were very afraid of the person who was stalking them. They might instead articulate that they were frustrated or upset. And so keeping in mind that those statistics are high, but we think that actual prevalence rates are actually much higher. We also know, and not surprising to many of you on the phone, especially if you're coming from the domestic violence field, that many victims of stalking and their offenders know one another in some way, shape, or form, many of which are current or former intimate partners. But keep in mind, roughly the math tells us that about 50% of stalking victims are not stalked by a current or former intimate partner. So one of the things to be thinking about in your response to stalking victims is your stalking response rooted in and seated in your domestic violence response? How would somebody who's a victim of stalking, who isn't being stalked by a current or former intimate partner, know that you provide services? How would they access those services? So for instance, oftentimes when you go in to train law enforcement, we might have law enforcement who say, you know what, we do an excellent job responding to stalking. Our response is sitting within our domestic violence unit, which is wonderful. And usually those individuals are trained much more so than a responding officer might be. But one of the things to be thinking about is, how do those cases get triaged, and how do they find the right people who might have additional training and resources? So for instance, one of the things that we often hear from stalking victims is that they're screened out of services. They might call a domestic violence and sexual assault program and ask for a place to stay because their neighbor is harassing them. They don't use the word stalking. They don't talk about the danger that comes from the stalking. And so a well-meaning volunteer or somebody who answers a crisis line might say to them, well, we work with victims of domestic violence in our shelters for victims of domestic violence, but you can call the homeless shelter if you need a place to stay, because they don't understand that that person who's calling in is a victim of stalking. So keep in mind as we talk today, how are we treating victims of stalking who aren't intimate partners? And when we are working with intimate partner relationships, are we identifying stalking within the context of all the other domestic violence behaviors that might be happening? So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. So to answer the question, I'm hoping all of you are on the phone because you want to know more about risk assessment. But to really answer the question of why are we doing this, why are we looking at the level of risk of stalking cases, one of the things that we know is that in intimate partner femicides, so that's the killing of a female victim by an intimate partner, 76% of those femicides, 76% of those murders were preceded by an episode of stalking within the year prior to the murder, and 85% of attempted femicides were preceded by an episode of stalking. And so I think while as a country and a field we have done a really good job of pushing forward risk assessment in domestic violence cases, we don't necessarily do a really great job of doing risk assessment in non-intimate partner domestic violence cases. And even if we are doing risk assessment in domestic violence cases, we aren't necessarily identifying behaviors that are only, and I'm using that in quotes, stalking behaviors. We might identify access to weapons, all those other things that are risk factors, but we might not identify the stalking behavior because we don't recognize it as stalking, or because we chalk it up as part of the bigger picture of domestic violence. So it's important when we look at domestic violence cases to pull out that stalking behavior, and it's important when we're working with non-domestic stalking cases to really understand what behaviors pose risk and what should we do in those particular situations. So we're going to delve pretty deep into that right now. So one of the things that we want to talk about are all the different stalking behaviors that happen. And we pull a lot of this work from Dr. T.K. Logan, who's at the University of Kentucky, and Robert Walker, and their information from their framework for assessment and safety planning in stalking cases. And some of you on the phone might be like, I don't care about research. I don't care what I have to say. We'll make sure we do a good job today of helping you connect what we know from the research to what we're doing every single day. And one of the things that we know is that oftentimes victims of stalking will approach someone and they will describe what's happening in their particular situation, but they will not identify that they're a victim of stalking. So we know that oftentimes we'll say, you know, are you being stalked? And victims will say, no. But if we break down the behaviors and the tactics that are involved in stalking situations, and we ask victims things like, is somebody accessing your social media? Is somebody bothering you and you don't want them to? Is somebody sending you unwanted text messages? Is somebody showing up unwanted and uninvited at your house? Then victims say, well, yeah, all of that's happening to me. But they don't identify that they're a victim of stalking. So one of the really important things to know is that unless we are asking about the specific behaviors and the specific tactics, victims will oftentimes not identify that they are a victim of stalking. So sometimes what that means is we have to break down those behaviors and we have to ask specific questions about the tactics that they're experiencing. And so Dr. Logan and Walker put in this particular framework a very easy way of identifying those. And they refer to those 4 tactics as the SLY strategies. So like SLY, but it is actually an acronym for SLII. And those 4 tactics include surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference. So surveillance is the one that we always start with when we look at these particular tactics, because it's the one that's present the most often, and a lot of times if people identify that stalking is happening, it's happening because their surveillance behaviors are happening. We also know that the surveillance behaviors are associated with more severe violence, and that there's an increased risk of fear for victims when surveillance is happening. So we know that one research group found that women who reported that their partner that spied on them or followed them are actually twice as likely to experience an attempted or actual homicide than people who don't report stalking. The other thing we need to keep in mind besides the surveillance behaviors are what's the definition of the life invasion, intimidation, and interference piece of things. So life invasion is entry by the stalker either directly or through some type of electronic means into the private sphere of a victim's life. So it might occur in public, but the behavior that's happening is entering a victim's privacy. And then intimidation is probably going to be pretty common to those of you on the phone. Those are direct and indirect threats that happen. It can include things like property damage. And then the last one is interference through sabotage or attack. So those are things like ruining a victim's reputation, violating a civil protection order, etc. So one of the things that I would love for all of you, since we have so many of you on the phone, we're up to 200 of you now, is to give me some examples that you have seen in your work and chat them in the chat feature of surveillance. So we'll start with surveillance because that's the easiest one. But again, surveillance is following a victim or monitoring their behavior. So what are some of the examples that you have seen of surveillance in the work that you've done? And bonus points for somebody who can come up with an example I haven't heard before. Ooh, okay, some great ones. So folks are saying things like following victims, monitoring their online presence, putting audio recorders in their home, sitting in trees outside their residence. Somebody also said accessing our services after their partner did. So showing up and pretending to be the victim in this situation to be able to see if they can gather information from your agency. That's an excellent example. Great job. Then the other thing would be, what about some examples of life invasion? And keep in mind, life invasion, again, for that example, is entering directly or through electronic means into a victim's private sphere of their life. Awesome. Some of you are saying sending gifts, asking friends or family about victims. Absolutely. Monitoring software, sending friends information, contacting children, calling their work nonstop. Excellent examples. The other things that I would point out with life invasion is that also includes property invasion as well as public humiliation. So we have a lot of stalkers who will force a confrontation. They'll show up at the victim's work or the victim's gym and start a conversation, and victims are embarrassed and they want the conversation to stop. And so they might agree to things like, okay, I'll sit in the car and talk to you, or yes, I'll meet you for dinner so we can just hash this out so you'll leave me alone. And so stalkers are very aware of what can cause embarrassment and things that victims worry about, and so they will manipulate those things to gain access to victims. So what about interference? What examples can you all think of interference? Keeping in mind that it's interference through sabotage or attack. Somebody said false allegations, the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Children's Services. Excellent example. Or gaining access to a home by calling in like a service order, so somebody to fix the refrigerator or fix the furnace, or sending people to an agency to see if they can find out information, or filing legal cases to force contact with the victim. That's an excellent example, Leanna. We often see victims who are manipulated through the court system by the offender. Those are great examples. And then what about intimidation? I love that you are all participating. Thank you. So folks saying following victims to social events, so showing up at a basketball game or the movies, or Threatening victims that they're going to report them for crimes, absolutely. Threat of harm to either the victim or the offender. So some offenders will threaten to harm themselves, so they'll threaten suicide. Someone else mentioned calling the police on the victim. Absolutely, I don't think we can undermine certain looks or gestures. Excellent examples. So some of you might be like, why did we just spend a few minutes naming those particular behaviors? What we have found out from our work with victims is that when we are specifically asking victims about these behaviors, more often than not, they are experiencing these behaviors, but they forget to mention or they overlook them when they're making up their reports to us. So for the law enforcement on the call, these are particular questions that you could ask victims about the experiences that have been happening to them. For individuals on the phone from safety agencies, if you're working with a domestic violence or sexual assault advocacy agency, asking about these questions so that you can better safety plan with victims. What we know over and over and over again is that victims will minimize their situations and that oftentimes they don't necessarily think about the behaviors that are happening as stalking behaviors. So making sure that we articulate these behaviors, we ask specific questions about these behaviors when we're talking with victims is really important. And so understanding these SLI strategies, the surveillance, the life invasion, the intimidation and interference is really important when it comes to risk assessment. And in fact, the risk assessment that we're going to use today and highlight builds off of these SLI strategies. So it's really important to understand all these different behaviors that are happening as a result of the stalking. The other thing that we want to talk about is that those SLI tactics often happen in patterns, in what we call DIF patterns. So DIF stands for the duration, the intensity, and the frequency. So what we know is that obviously the increased frequency, intensity, and duration of the stalking case, the higher the level of risk. One of the things that we want to keep in mind is that the duration of the stalking case might be unknown. It might be still continuing. It might have been going on for the last 2 years, and there's no end in sight. The other thing we need to be thinking about with frequency is not only how often it's happening, but the number of different tactics. So is the offender using tactics from all 4 of those SLI strategies, as well as the intensity. So where are the locations that it's happening? Is it happening just in the home? Is it happening in public? That type of a thing. So the DIF pattern is something that we also want to keep in mind as we go forward. And somebody's asking about a transcript of today's webinar. You do have the materials available for you in the PDF below where you're asking questions, Becky. And I can check in with our webinar host to see if we can get a transcript for today. Otherwise, we're happy to help you if you need it with the PowerPoints as well. So, and we are recording this webinar, and it's going to be available on Spark's website. So you're more than welcome to view it again. We usually get that up on the website within the next couple of days. So, and then as we move forward, then what's the framework that we're using? How are we assessing these particular cases? So the framework that we're using understands the SLI strategies that we just talked about and the DIF patterns as part of an intentional course of conduct that the offender is engaging in. We also need to look at the reasonable fear component, so understanding both implicit and explicit threats, as well as the context and fear that victims are experiencing. And then what's the unwantedness? How has a victim resisted and the stalker persisted in these particular cases? So we really break that down into understanding basically 14 risk factors. And I've put them, and Dr. Logan has put them in like 4 different categories. So the first 3 are really assessing the big picture of stalking. And so those 3 risk factors are looking at the course of conduct, which includes the SLI strategies and the DIF pattern that we just mentioned. It's looking at the escalation of this particular case. Has the frequency and level of the stalking tactics increased? And then we're looking at the nature and the context of the threats. Are those threats made with a weapon? Are those threats made to harm the victim themselves? Is the stalker following through with those threats? So the 3 risk factors within the big picture, again, are the course of conduct, the escalation, and the nature and context of the threats. And then we're looking at the stalker mindset. What How's the stalker feeling about this particular case? What's their motive behind all of this? Are they wanting to get back together with the victim? Are they seeking affection from the victim? As well as understanding proxy stalking. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, proxy stalking is what all of you named in the chat history, which was using friends and family to gather information, so using a third party to gather information, as well as access to weapons, and the victim's resistance and the stalker persistence. So how has the victim communicated to the offender that behavior is unwanted? And if that's happened, what has the stalker done after that? So keep in mind that one of the things that comes up a lot when we talk about stalking cases is, has the victim told the offender that the behavior is unwanted? Has there been a clear line in the sand drawn saying, I don't want to have contact with you? And where people get frustrated as responders is when victims have communicated to offenders that they don't want to have contact, and yet the victim still has contact with the offender. I would ask you all to lean on your strengths of what you know about domestic violence, and that many victims of domestic violence engage their offenders because they're gathering information. And the same thing happens both for intimate partner stalking victims and non-intimate partner stalking victims. Victims oftentimes are engaging with the offender because they're safety planning. The more information they find out about the offender's mood and what they're thinking and how they're feeling, the better they are able to safety plan, which is problematic when all of us want that clear line in the sand drawn and we say no contact, and then there's no more contact. So one of the things that we can do when we work with stalking victims is explain to them, it's great if we can draw that line in the sand, that cease and desist, don't bother me anymore type of behavior. And we know that you might re-engage with the offender, but every time you re-engage with the offender, it reinforces their behavior. So if an offender calls the victim 36 times, and on the 37th time the victim picks up the phone, even if the victim tells them to pound sand and go away and I don't want to have anything to do with you, the offender next time will call back 37 times because the victim answered on the 37th call. So keep in mind that when we re-engage with the offender, even if it's negatory or negative behavior, so for instance, even if the victim calls the police, anytime the offender gets to engage with the victim is a win for them. And so what we typically would say is, if the victim is able to, can they stay away from the offender? Can they disengage from the offender? But also being very careful to understand that we cannot victim blame in these situations, and explaining to victims we absolutely understand why you re-engage. We need to know that reason as we move forward so that we can document it in files, so that we can explain it to the prosecutor, that type of thing. So hopefully that answers some people's questions and some of the frustrations that come up in these particular cases. The other thing we need to be looking at, the next set of risk factors, are stalker history. So what's the stalker's history of partner control? What's their history of domestic violence and jealousy and violence towards other people? What's their history of violence and abuse to others outside of their intimate partners? So are they people who frequently get in bar brawls? What's their criminal justice history? So have they been arrested before for other offenses? And are they using substances, or do they have mental health issues? Those particular factors, those factors are all something to keep in mind as well. So, and many of you are mentioning, yeah, a lot of times when we look at these stalking cases, we're dealing with really difficult cases because we're court ordering victims to have contact with offenders because there's custody agreements in place. So keeping in mind that lots of victims are having to interact with their stalker, that doesn't mean we can't move a stalking case forward. It means we need to know the whys of why this is happening, and we need a safety plan around them. So keep that in mind. And then the last set of risk factors are victim vulnerability. What's the level of fear that a victim is experiencing? How tech savvy is the offender? And that one I absolutely agree with, and I will put it out there that Google can teach a stalking offender almost anything. So keep in mind that even if we have an offender who supposedly isn't tech savvy, there's lots of information that they can gather from the internet, unfortunately. And then the last factor is the victim vulnerability. So looking at how vulnerable our victims are in these particular situations is also part of the risk factor. So for those 14 factors, and I realize I went over those quickly, but you'll see them come into place as we do the risk assessment, but also keep in mind that victims' perception of risk is a really strong predictor of reassault. And oftentimes what we know is that victims are better able to predict whether something's going to happen again better than any risk management tool. So the tool that we're going to go over today is excellent, and it does a good job of predicting recidivism. But if all else fails, ask your victim what they think is going to happen next. And more often than not, they are completely accurate in their assessment of whether something's going to continue or not. So oftentimes we'll have victims say, well, go ahead and arrest him, but it's not going to do any good. He's going to continue to do what he does. What we know and what people always want to know is, how do we stop stalking? And what we know is, in some instances, when there is a civil protection order issued or when an arrest is made, when there's some type of intervention, the stalking stops. For other cases, it does not. And people always say, well, how do we know which cases are going to continue? Part of that is doing a risk assessment like we're going to do. And part of that is asking the victim, do you think that if you get a civil protection order, the stalking will stop? And victims might say, no, it's not going to stop. He doesn't care if he gets arrested. Other people will say, well, you know what, it might stop because the offender might be scared of the repercussions that would happen with their job, etc. So keep in mind that victims' perceptions are very many times completely accurate. The other thing that we get often asked in these particular cases is, what if the victim's not articulating fear? And my state statute says that victims have to be in fear, so how am I supposed to articulate that a victim feels fear? Sometimes victims won't verbally say that they're fearful, but their actions will tell us that they're fearful. So asking victims things like, what have you changed since the stalking has started? Have you changed your routines? Have you gotten a dog? Have you changed the locks on your car? Have you changed your social media use? Do you change your normal way that you go back and forth to work every day? How have you been eating and sleeping? All of those changes can also help us articulate that a victim is feeling fear. So keep that in mind as well, as understanding that when we look at the impact of stalking, that many times as a criminal justice system, we are evaluating harm and impact based on physical harm. And we aren't understanding the emotional and psychological harm that happens in stalking cases. And what happens when we do that is we end up really focusing on the physical aspect of stalking, and we miss stalking within the context of everything else. One of the studies shows us that we looked at a department that had about 1,800 stalking cases, and 1 in 6 of those cases had enough evidence that stalking could have been charged. But out of those 1,785 cases, only 1 resulted in a stalking charge, even though almost 200 or 300 of them had enough evidence that we could have charged stalking. And so what happens many times in stalking cases is we are evaluating based on the physical harm and sometimes overlooking the emotional impact. And some of you are saying, well, yeah, we're doing that because we don't have a state statute to direct that. But considering your stalking statute and what can we prove in these particular cases and what can we bring forward and how are we asking about these tactics can help us in our ability to be able to move stalking cases forward within the criminal justice system. Keeping in mind that for most victims, they are absolutely terrified about not knowing what's going to happen next. The fear of the unknown, where the offender is going to show up, what they're going to do, is the fear that's articulated most frequently. Yes, they're afraid of the offender themselves, but not knowing when the stalking is ever going to stop or what the offender is capable of is extremely traumatizing to stalking victims. And so how are we doing our work in a way that helps identify these stalking behaviors, acknowledges the harm that victims are feeling in these particular cases, and help us put all this information together to be able to move these particular cases forward. And one of the tools that we would recommend when we look at risk assessment is the Stalking, Harassment, and Risk Profile. Just out of curiosity, out of a show of hands, on the top of your webinar platform, you'll see a little person with a raised hand. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of or used the SHARP assessment before in a stalking case. Oh, it's always nice when I see hands going up. Yay. And for all the hands that are up, it's probably less than a third of us. I'm going to say less than a fourth of us. So one of the things that we want to go over today is the actual assessment itself. So this assessment itself goes over all the risk factors that we already discussed. So again, if you're short-term memory isn't the best. Those risk factors, going back over them, are these 14 risk factors. So the course of conduct in these particular cases, the slides don't want to keep up with my frantic scrolling. So they're the course of conduct in these particular cases, the escalation that's been happening as part of that course of conduct, the nature and context of the threats that have been happening. So those three things is the big picture. The stalker motive, if there's proxy stalking, which again is using outside people, the weapons, as well as victim resistance and stalker persistence, the stalker history, so history of partner control, so domestic violence history as well as history of violence with other people, their criminal justice history, and their substance abuse and mental health status, as well as the fear level, the stalker's level of technology expertise, and the victim's vulnerability. So those are the 14 risk factors that we're going to look at. So as we look at those things, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is the assessment that we can use. And so for those of you that were familiar with the stalking assessment, one of the things that we can look at is how do we do this assessment in a way that we can gather the most information possible. And so one of the questions that we often get about SHARP is, who can use it, how much does it cost, and where do I find it? So this is the screenshot of the SHARP assessment, and it was developed by Dr. Logan and is based on the framework that we just talked about. And you can find this either at coercivecontrol.org or stalkingrisk.com. Both of those URLs will take you directly to the assessment. The nice thing about SHARP is as you do the assessment, it not only gives you the risk level of this particular case, but it also gives you a safety management tool. Essentially, it spits out a safety plan that is coordinated to the risk assessment that you just did. So keep that in mind. It is free to access. You can absolutely access the assessment for free. It does not take a considerable amount of time, and anybody can answer the question. So you can answer them with a victim present or without a victim present. So you, as somebody who's a criminal justice professional, can answer on behalf of a victim. What you need to keep in mind is that it is a little bit lengthy. There's like 45 questions as part of the assessment, but it does not take that long. They're yes, no questions. So keep in mind that that's one of the things that some people give us feedback about is it's really long, but what we know is that stalking is so dynamic and so nuanced that oftentimes we need to ask more questions. And so that's why it's considerably long. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to watch a short video about a stalking case, and then we're going to pause it, and then we're going to do an actual SHARP assessment, and then we're going to figure out what that assessment tells us about this particular case. So Daniel's going to go ahead and start the video now. For those of you that are on the phone, you may not be able to hear it, but we'll answer the question as soon as it's finished.
It all began in the fall of '98. At 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy.
You know, in the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies, but I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why.
Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From the day she left him, he began stalking her.
Calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move.
He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, you know, he was just going to persist with it.
At one point, Peggy had called me in the afternoon and said, "You'll never believe this. Patrick jumped out of the bushes at work with a dozen roses and a wedding ring and asked me to marry him." And Peggy said, "I walked right by him, I got in my car and drove away." Peggy was very, very strong and very determined to shake this man from her life. And the more she ignored him, the angrier he got. Then he progressed to paperwork. He made a really nice 8.5 by 11 flyer with a photo of my sister on it. Wrote all sorts of incredible obscenities about her and put her cell phone number. on it and distributed it where she had her nails done, where she had her hair cut, where her gym was, where she worked.
She took the flyer to the police and showed them that, but there was nothing they can do. It was only a flyer.
But I think at that point, you know, we were still thinking that he was just playing a game. We didn't think it would escalate. And then he took greater steps because she wasn't reacting.
That June, our family gathered in Orlando, Florida for my brother's wedding. Peggy brought a new man she had begun dating, Mark Sparks.
Patrick knew that we would all be in Florida for this wedding. And he had flown to my mother's house in Poland, Ohio, and on her white garage doors with black spray paint, he sprayed "PK is a whore" on the doors.
Patrick then returned to Albuquerque to set fire to Mark's house.
I noticed I had about 8 messages on my cell phone, and I knew something was wrong. So I listened to the messages. My neighbor, my mother, the police, the fire department were all calling and saying that my house was on fire. Right away, Peggy knew that Patrick had done this.
Peggy and Mark were going from hotel to hotel because they had nowhere to live because Mark's house was set on fire. We were at the point we didn't want Peggy to call us because we didn't know if he was trying to trace a phone call. We didn't want him to find out Peggy's whereabouts. Peggy, it seemed for a while, was just in hiding.
Everything that Patrick did to Peggy, Peggy went and reported it to the police. She was getting very, very, very agitated with them because nothing was being done to stop this man from harassing her.
Patrick's behavior was escalating, and Peggy got a restraining order. She went to the police and filed for stalking charges. The trial was delayed for several months. Nothing was being done.
Okay, as Daniel takes that down, I'm going to also work to share my screen at this particular moment in time. So what we're going to do now, as long as I don't mess this up, that's always the scary part of doing something online, is we are going to do the actual risk assessment. So what you see on front of you is the assessment. I just went to stalkingrisk.com and pulled up the assessment, and we're going to go through Peggy and Patrick's case as a group together. So what we're going to do is go through the questions. Some of the times you will not have answers to these particular questions. Sometimes you will. I'll provide the information in case we don't have it. So the first thing that this assessment asks, because it can assess both intimate partner stalking relationships as well as non-intimate partner stalking situations, is what type of situation are we assessing? Do we have a male offender or a female offender? And obviously we have a male offender. And then it asks for the offender's name or initials. I'm not going to do initials because they both have the same initials. So the offender's name is Patrick, and it asks his age. And his age is approximately, at this time, 34 years old. And then it asks for the victim's name, which in this case is Peggy, and Peggy is a female, and asks for Peggy's age. I'm not sure how many of you caught it, but at this particular moment in time, she's 29 years old. And then it asks their relationship. Are they a current partner? Are they ex-partners, separated, other type of relatives? So you can see that we can assess all different types of situations. Obviously, in this case, we're looking at an ex-partner and they're separated. And then it's asking who's answering these questions. Is the victim themselves answering the question, a friend or family member, or a professional on behalf? And so we're going to all be professionals today. Might be a stretch for some of us. And then what agency we're representing. So we can just pick one. I'm just going to pick that we're part of a law enforcement agency. And then, are you doing this assessment to get information about a real case? So yes, we're looking at a real case, or no, I'm just practicing. This obviously is a real case, but I'm still going to say that we're practicing just because this assessment is gathering information on the back end to look at who's using the assessment. So I'm just going to say that we're practicing this particular case. I would encourage all of you to get on here and practice with Sharp before you actually do one of these assessments with a victim. And then what state are we in? I'm just going to pick one, and then moving on from there. So the next set of questions is asking no, yes, or suspected. Has Patrick been tracking, following, or monitoring Peggy in any way? Yes, he was. Has he repeatedly invaded her life and privacy? Yes, he has. Has he more than one time intimidated or scared her? Yes, he has. And has he significantly and directly interfered with her life? Yes. All of this is part of the course of conduct in the risk factors that we are looking at. Has he physically or sexually assaulted her while he was threatening her? Not that we know of at that particular moment in time. And has he forcibly kept her from leaving or held her against her will? At that point in time, no, he had not. And then it's asking, when did this particular case begin? So because we're doing this in 2020, some of you caught on to Peggy's sister saying that this had been happening for about 3 years. So I'm just going to say that it started January 1st of 2017, just so that we get an accurate picture of the length of time that it's been happening. So what's nice about this is that it then checks your math to see, and is that correct? And you say yes, because we know, as we talked about earlier, one of the important factors is how long this case has been happening, so the duration of it. And then what's the intensity? Has he regularly contacted her in more than one way? Yes, he had. Has he bothered her at more than one location or on a phone or a computer? And yes, he had been doing that. And has his behavior increased in frequency or severity? Yes, we heard Peggy's sisters articulating that things were getting more and more frequent. So it's asking, on a typical month, how many days does he initiate contact with Peggy? What you need to know is, as you fill out this assessment, these particular answers aren't extremely important. We know that you might be guessing about these particular things, so just do the best you can. That's why there's so many questions in SHARP, in that it asks questions in different ways so that we can still get accurate answers. So keep in mind that this is just like an estimate. And then it's also asking how many times has Peggy separated or broken up with Patrick. In this particular case, it was just once. She broke up with him, and then all this behavior was happening afterwards. But obviously, we know in some stalking cases, there can be frequent interactions where the victim has broken up with the offender. Has Patrick left objects or made gestures? One of the things I should point out is if we had put that they weren't in current or former intimate partners, that question would not pop up for you. So obviously, you can't break up with your boss. So that question wouldn't come up if that's the type of situation we are assessing. Then we're looking at the threats, both the explicit and implicit. So has he left objects or made gestures that felt threatening? He had put those flyers up. Has he threatened to physically hurt or kill Peggy? He had not at that particular moment in time. Has he described in detail how he wants to harm her? No. Has he threatened, harassed, stalked, or assaulted others close to Peggy? Yeah, obviously, if he sets Mark's house on fire, that can be one of the things that we're assessing. Has Patrick threatened to destroy property or harm pets? Yes. Has he directly or indirectly threatened Peggy with a gun? He had not at that moment in time. So it's hard when I'm doing this in front of an audience. Has he threatened to harm himself? He had not at that particular moment in time. Has he ever made a threat and then did exactly what was threatened, or taken steps to carry out a threat? Again, he had not at that particular moment in time. And if he had other people, like friends or family, so the proxy stalking, threatened, intimidated, or attacked Peggy, at this particular moment in time, no. And then we're looking at fear, concern for safety. So now we change from yes, no to not at all, somewhat, or extremely. So has Patrick's actions made Peggy afraid? Absolutely, I would say extremely. Has his actions made her concerned with the safety of her children or family members? Yes, remember the sister says we don't want her to contact us because we're afraid what he's going to do. Have his actions contributed to her making some significant life changes? So you hear that she's moved, that she's left her job, so those would all be significant life changes. Does she believe he's capable of harming her? Absolutely. And is she afraid or concerned about a significant financial or social impact, like the loss of her job or loss of housing, both of things which had happened, so we'll put extremely for that as well. And then has he been directly and clearly notified that his contact is unwanted? There was a civil protection order in place. You hear the family refer to it as a restraining order, so yes, he was notified. But has he persisted in contacting her? Yes. Is there a court order in place? Yes. And has, notice it only pops up the next question because we answered yes. Has he violated that protection order or court order? Yes, he had. He wasn't charged with it, but he had been violating it. Has he been controlling, extremely jealous, or physically violent towards Peggy or others in the past? He was very jealous and controlling of her. So we would say that he was extremely jealous and controlling. We don't know if he'd been with others in the past. We don't know that he had been physically violent or with other people, so we won't check those. Has he ever threatened or used a weapon? Has he strangled Peggy? Has he physically assaulted her or sexually assaulted her? Not at that time, so we'll say no. Does he have a criminal history, drug or alcohol problem, or serious mental health issues? He did not at the time. Has he thought about or attempted suicide in the past? He had not at the time. Is he obsessed with weapons, or does he have special military training? Is he law enforcement? Does he have a gun? He did not at that particular moment in time. Does Peggy believe he's using technology to threaten her? Some people say no to this question when we do it in person, and actually yes, because if you recall, her sister said we were afraid that he was hacking our phone lines, that he was gathering information through our phones. Do messages from Patrick suggest she feels rejected or humiliated? I would say yes, the flyers and the information that he had provided to her. Does he want revenge or blames Peggy for ruining his life? Suspected maybe. Is he unconcerned about severe consequences like jail? I would say yes, because he had been starting the house on fire, he vandalized her mother's house. Are there any potential upcoming events that concern her? Yes, because if you remember, there's an upcoming court hearing. Does Peggy feel she might have sent Patrick mixed messages, like telling him she didn't want contact but then responding to him? No, she was pretty clear. Does Peggy believe Patrick's aware that the things he's doing upset or bother her? Yes. And does she feel bad for him because he's depressed or had a hard life? I would say no to that one. And has the harassing, threatening, stalking behavior previously been reported to the police? Yes. Does Peggy feel like there's no consequences of his behavior? Yeah, you heard her family's frustration with the system. Even though things were happening, we all can see that the system was working the way the system works. What wasn't happening in this particular case is no one was doing a really great job of communicating with Peggy and her family. There wasn't a victim advocate in place. There was nobody who was communicating these things to Peggy and her family, and so I think there was a lot of frustration from the system because she didn't understand what was going on. Does Peggy feel she's more vulnerable to Patrick's stalking because there's significant things about the environment, like she lacks housing, she doesn't have a job, she's isolated? Yeah, all of those things. So she doesn't work or go to school with him. He isn't in a position of authority over her, but they don't have children in common. But she's not living in safe housing right now because she's bouncing from place to place. She's got limited access to resources. She's isolated, and she has limited access to safety measures at this particular moment in time. And then there's another place to add any relevant notes. So this might be where you want to add any notes about this particular situation, and this would show up in the risk assessment. So we're just going to leave those blank for now, and then we hit the next button. And what's going to happen is the system is going to generate both the risk assessment and the safety planning. So keep it in mind, like I said earlier, there's a risk assessment, and then there's a corresponding safety plan. So while the system does that, it's going to take a few seconds. We're going to go ahead and watch the end of the video. So Daniel, if you want to go ahead and bring the video up, we're going to find out what happens to Peggy. And I will give you a trigger warning that there is a 911 phone call that you'll hear.
Extremely frustrating. And in a time where you're being hunted by somebody and you feel more victimized by going through the system to protect yourself, then what good is it?
And I remember Peggy coming home having a binder of probably 200-300 pages in it of just everything she had documented. Peggy did all the footwork. Peggy did everything. She did everything right, but nobody would help her. Why? I don't know the answer to that.
And at this point, Peggy asked the DA, will it take a bullet to my head for you to do something about this?
With Patrick's behavior escalating, we just felt like, at least temporarily, let's get you out of here. Let's wait for this stalking trial to come up. And by that time, we can determine whether it's safe for you to move back home.
Peggy soon left for Turlock, California to begin a new life. She did everything she could to leave no trace or trail to protect herself. 6 days before her stalking trial was to happen, Patrick found Peggy after months of searching.
So how did this happen? After paying a private investigator for information, Peggy's stalker drove to the Albuquerque airport, checked a handgun and a hunting rifle at the airline counter, and flew to San Jose, California. He retrieved his bag with his weapons, rented a car, and arrived at her neighborhood. He posed as a private investigator, approached a delivery driver who recognized her photo, and gave him her exact address.
He caught up with her on her way out of the house early Saturday morning. He duct taped her hands together, he choked her, and he beat her. He beat her so severely with his gun that her blonde hair turned bright red. Despite all of this, Peggy managed to break free and flee to a neighbor's apartment where she was able to call 911.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118. He's going to be dead. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break in now. Does he have a gun right now? He does. He's already beat my head. If you don't get her, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly. My head is stopping wet with blood. He gets in this house. He's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh, my God. How close are they? They're on their way. Patrick, I'm the only one here. He ran. Please. Stop. Female. Please stop it. I think he's going to kill me. Is he, ma'am?
The SWAT team arrived. Peggy told them, if you open this door, he will kill me.
And the police officer said, let's not talk about that, Peggy. Let's talk about your family. And Peggy had said, tell my mother that I love her. And tell my sister who's pregnant to name the baby after me. And tell my niece, Abby, she will have a guardian angel. And those were Peggy's 3 last requests before she was killed.
I just remember.
Okay, everybody take a deep breath, because that video can be a little bit hard to watch, and some of you may have seen it before. We have permission from Peggy's family to show it, and in fact, Peggy's family is the reason we have Stalking Awareness Month, because of their efforts to promote the month nationally in January, because January is the month that Patrick killed Peggy. So I'll go back to sharing my screen really quickly with you and show you that while we are watching the video, the assessment went ahead and generated both the risk assessment and the safety management tool. So we would just click on those particular tools and they're going to download as Word documents. What's really important to know is that you need to save those Word documents on your computer. You can't just go back into Sharp and they're still there because it's a safety mechanism. So it gets rid of the cookies disappear, etc. So you would be able to open these risk assessments and it actually gives you the assessment itself. So this particular one is the steps for Peggy, so that would be the safety management tips, so the safety planning. The other one is the assessment tool itself. So this gives you the actual risk assessment. So you would go through and it defines all the things that we talked about, the course of conduct, the risk profile, and then based on what we answered, this is what Peggy shows. Below is the summary of the 10 serious risk factors that are presented in this case out of 14 serious risk factors. So you can see in Peggy's particular case, and we can go ahead and stop sharing my screen now, Danielle, and go back to the PowerPoint, that in this particular case, 10 out of 14 factors is pretty serious. And you see how, unfortunately, this particular case ended up. And so one of the things that we need to keep thinking about as we move forward is then, Danielle, I'm not seeing the PowerPoint on my screen. Hopefully it's showing on other people. But keeping in mind that as we go forward, one of the things that you can be thinking about is how do you use that safety plan? Do you be able to safety plan with Peggy? And how do you have those conversations about risk assessment? And how do we use this risk assessment? I found it an excellent way as a point of contact with victims to be able to have discussions about safety and to be able to point out the particular risk factors. It can be an excellent form to use to be able to communicate across disciplines with law enforcement and prosecutors about the level of dangerous in this situation as well. So I'm going to keep on going even though my PowerPoint isn't back up. Danielle, I don't know if you want to jump in here for a second, but I'm going to we're finishing up with closing, but one of the things that I would say to all of you is where do we go from here? And so I would encourage you to think about the ways that you can use this risk assessment in the cases that you're working on as well as how do we assist victims with safety planning. So can we use the safety planning generated by the assessment? But I would also encourage you to check out Spark's website, where we have additional safety planning documents available for victims, as well as documentation logs. So how do we help victims gather the documentation that they might need in these particular cases? And then we have brochures about stalking and those safety plans as well on our website, so please check out all that information. And again, our website is stalkingawareness.org. So if you have additional questions, this particular webinar will be posted on our website, and we can discuss those particular questions with you, and the webinar can be viewed by others in your office. Daniel, are we able to make any progress on getting the PowerPoint back up, or is it just me that can't see it? It might just be me. So I'm hoping all of you can still hear me at least. Hopefully we didn't lose communication completely. But for those of you that are still on the phone, I'd highly encourage you to get on our website. Please, if you have any questions, I'm reconnecting to Adobe Connect, so I'll be on the chat feature if any of you have any questions. So otherwise, go ahead and stay on board. I know there's an evaluation that's coming as well, and it looks like Danielle, I'm rejoining, so hopefully the rest of you were able to see, but I don't know. I wasn't. We got to love technology today. We almost made it through the whole thing. Some people are asking about certificates. We don't typically provide certificates of attendance just because there's 200 of you and there's 2 of us that work at Spark, but we can certainly try to accommodate you if you need those. So please email us at Spark, not Daniel, because poor Daniel won't be able to help you out. But if you want to email us at Spark, my contact information is on the last slide, and I think Daniel can move that forward for us. And you can feel free to reach out to us or to me directly, and I can assist you with any of those other things. I apologize for the little technical glitch at the end. But if you have additional questions, please feel free to stay on the chat. I'll stay on for a few minutes. Happy to answer any of your questions. Otherwise, I want to thank you all for the amazing work that you do on behalf of survivors. And I want to thank the amazing team at NCJ SCJ who does all the hard work of pulling up the videos and hosting things in the background. So thank you, Daniel, and your team for that. And hope you all have a fabulous rest of your day.